GST that will roll out on the 1st of July. It's indeed a pleasure to interview the former Finance Minister P Chidambaram right here at his residence in Chennai. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. In your own admission, you've said this is the dawn of a new era, the turn of a century as far as taxpayers are concerned. You can hate the GST, you can love it, you can ignore it, but by all accounts, this is a momentous occasion for the Indian economy. It's a big event. Do you regret not being able to sign it off finally, even though you served as Finance Minister for various terms?
Well, I can't rewrite history. Those who should regret are those who stalled it for 7 years. I'm happy that the idea that was conceived by the UPA is taking shape, however imperfect it may be. I'm happy that I was able to roll out VAT. I was able to move GST to a point where it could have been rolled out in about a year or so. So overall, I'm happy.
You're happy overall because eventually an idea that you believe is good for the Indian economy is going to roll out. But what is it that the present government could do, or what is it that Finance Minister Jaitley could do to drum up consensus that perhaps the UP or you could not?
Well, firstly, they have an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha. We don't, we didn't, never did.
But this is a lot between state and centre as well.
Let's start with that. You bargain from a position of strength that you are a government with an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha. And therefore, bills can be passed in the Lok Sabha. Number one. Number two, the consensus that was built over a period of time, say under Mr. Sushil Modi as chairman, then Mr. Ashim Das Gupta as chairman, Mr. Jaitley's State Finance Ministers Council built on that consensus. In fact, somebody has written that the Modi-Jaitley pair stands on the shoulders of previous PM-FM pairs. So over a period of time, it becomes easier to tie up the loose ends. The initial consensus building was a difficult part, and I think the UPA steered the GST process to a large extent. We just couldn't clinch it on the last mile.
So what you're essentially saying is this is almost like a baton relay and this is the last lap that the BJP has been able to run. I know you're critical of the Modi government's policies. You've pulled them up, you've criticized them when warranted, and you've also praised it when necessary. Where do you believe the credit for rolling out the GST lies? Who will you give credit for?
Well, I can't yet give full credit, because the GST that will be rolled out on the 1st of July is an imperfect GST. I think they were in a great hurry to roll it out on 1st July, ignoring well-meaning advice to defer it by 2 or 3 months. I suggested we roll it out on October 1. And then too many compromises have been made which have added to the imperfections of the GST. And traveling around the country, I am absolutely convinced that businesses are not ready, businesses are uncertain, they are apprehensive, and I think in course of time these imperfections will become visible.
I agree with you that imperfections will become visible, but the idea also is that, and I'm going to talk about that, can we ever be fully prepared for a reform like the GST? But when you say this is an imperfect GST with its flaws to begin with, will you refute me when I say that perfection cannot be the enemy of good? And by all practical purposes, this is a beginning of the GST. We will perhaps improve it along the way.
If they had put in harder work, if they had taken the opposition parties into confidence, if they had persuaded the opposition party leaders in Parliament to talk to the state governments run by those opposition parties, I think we could have had a much better GST day after tomorrow. They spoke to the state governments, but they did not speak to the leaders of the political parties who are running those governments.
But don't the state governments have to be taken into confidence? They're the ones who are giving up a lot of their fiscal space,
Of course,
so to say.
Of course they have to be taken into confidence. But to make it a more perfect GST, I think it was necessary to take into confidence the leaders of the political parties are running the state governments.
So when you
like
say
Congress, CPIM, SP at that time, these leaders ought to have been taken into confidence.
So you believe there was a crisis of confidence in the center while they were reaching out to the states, but these were Congress, I mean a lot of these governments were Congress-run governments.
Yes,
so in some sense the Congress party was on board.
BJP somehow shuns the idea of talking to the Congress.
But a lot of these governments and most decisions in the council have been taken by consensus. Very few things have ever been put to vote. In that sense, the Congress has been on board.
Consensus hides the fact that there are dissenting voices. And you've now heard the most powerful dissenting voice from Bengal.
That's right.
Please remember, Mr. Amit Mitra chairs the State Finance Ministers' Council, and his government is dissenting. His government is boycotting the inaugural function. Therefore, consensus hides the fact that there are dissent.
So while there are dissents and while the GST will still be a reality, if I may ask you, what took the GST so long? I mean, was it political optics, political compulsions, economic fallacy? What took the GST? The GST has been in the making for over a decade's time.
Well, it gathered momentum only in about 2006-07 or so. And then we had the international financial crisis in 2008, which I think was the main preoccupation of the central government for at least a year or so.
That's right, yes.
When Mr. Mukherjee was the finance minister. It gathered steam again when Mr. Mukherjee introduced the GST Constitution Amendment Bill.
That's right.
And I tried to take it forward. But the BJP simply stalled it. Between August 2012 and May 2014, the BJP simply refused to let us move forward.
And so there wasn't a GST.
So we lost 18 months that way.
You're a grassroots politician. You believe in electoral politics. You go back to your constituency. Do you believe a utopian GST, the one that economists propagate, is ever going to be possible in this country? A transparent one tax, one India?
I'm not pleading for a utopian GST, but the obvious wrinkles should have been removed. For example, number one, we had pleaded for a 3-rate GST. A standard rate, a demerit rate, and a concessional rate.
Right.
But we now have almost 6 or 7 rates. 0, 3, 5, 12, 18, 28, 40, I don't know, with cessors added. Such a plethora of rates, which I think is a deep flaw. The second is the diarchy. A little more persuasion, little more discussion, little more bringing the leaders of the political parties, not simply state finance ministers, leaders of the political parties together, holding consultations with them, could have avoided this diarchy. You know how the diarchy is going to work? All taxpayers below 1.5 crore turnover
That's right.
will be divided into 2 categories, 90% for the states, 10% for the center. And then anyone with a turnover of over 1.5 crore will be divided again into 2 categories, 50% for the states, 50% for the center. And who will be my tax administrator, center or state, will be decided by the GSTN. In what way? By a lottery? I don't know. By a random number? I don't know. And then the worst is, if I'm doing business in more than one state, I have to register in every state.
That's right, yes.
Which means, if I have a turnover, say, of more than 1.5 crore in each of my 10 states. Now, for all I know, the lottery could pick me and put me under the state government, the 50% that goes to the state government, which means I'll have 10 state governments administering the tax for me. I think it's quite mind-boggling. People are not willing to look into the detail. I think the diarchy is a second problem. The third problem is that the multifarious taxes and the diarchy and the compromises that you made have still left a large amount of discretion in the tax administrator. Fitments are liable to be interpreted differently. Mr. Veerappa Moily asked a very apt question. Is Kit Kat chocolate or biscuit? Now, it's because you treat chocolates and biscuits differently, the question arises. If you treated chocolates and biscuits the same, as far as GST is concerned, this question will not arise. Similarly, there's too much discretion in tax administrators. It's quite possible that one state administrator will decide one way, another state administrator will decide another way. Too much of discretion. And the worst is the anti-profiteering provision.
I'll come to anti-profiteering.
That's draconian.
That's right.
That was intended to please the CBEC officials, and I think it's a grave mistake.
I'm going to talk to you about anti-profiteering in just a bit, but I think the wrinkles that you spoke about in the GST, would you not agree with me that they reflect the will of the states who were a part of the GST Council, the states who were trying to protect their fiscal turf? So in some sense, it is also the will of the Congress party represented by those states.
Which means the states don't believe, in the heart of their hearts, they don't believe that GST is a more efficient tax. It will capture nearly all transactions and it will eventually bring us more revenue. If you don't share that belief, then you're not a votary of GST. You're simply going along with some kind of a changed system. You must believe that GST will capture nearly all commercial transactions. You must believe that GST is a more efficient tax. You must believe that it will bring you larger revenue.
Is there also a disconnect of sorts between the central leadership of most opposition parties vis-a-vis what the states govern?
There is.
And why so?
Well, why so is because the nature of politics, the structure of political parties. Central leadership is weaker today than it was a few years ago. And therefore, the central leaders can only do so much to bring their state leaderships on board. And each state, depending on whether it's a manufacturing state or a consuming state, has different priorities. But I think that if they had brought the leaders of the political parties around the table, parallel with discussions with state finance ministers, and if the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister had engaged the leaders of political parties, so many of these wrinkles could have been ironed out.
I will turn focus and talk to you specifically about the economic gains from the GST, and however imperfect this will be, I'm certain that you agree with me when I say this is going to be definitely an improvement over the present messy maze of taxes that exist in India. There were accounts of a
lot of people think that one large mess is being replaced by a smaller mess.
A smaller mess is better than a large mess.
Well, a smaller mess is indeed better than a large mess. But a mess is a mess.
Okay, will that mess allude to economic gains? There were various kinds of projections made that there will be a 1.5 to 2 percentage point to GDP growth in the short term, about 0.9 to 0.8% addition. What are the economic gains that you envisage from the GST? And don't say none.
I'm not saying none. Why do you anticipate my answer?
No,
these are purely speculative numbers. I believe GST is a more efficient tax, because it captures nearly all transactions which were outside one tax net or the other, and it avoids cascading of taxes. And if you administer one tax rather than administer a dozen taxes, excise duty, service tax, VAT, luxury tax, octroi, entry tax, etc., etc., it makes for far simpler administration, and the Revenue Minister, Finance Minister of States has a much better control over the tax administration and tax collection. So clearly, GST itself is a gain for India. Now, what it will bring in terms of GDP growth, I cannot say. In the initial stages, there will be attempts to avoid GST. For example, people will try to keep their turnover below 20 lakhs.
That's right.
To get out of the tax net. People will try to, the Indian jugaad way of try to find some way out of the GST. So initially, I think there will be few gains. But in the long run, I think GST should, if all goes well, if things fall in place, if some of the wrinkles that I spoke about are avoided or ironed out in course of time, and the states become more confident of administering GST, I think it should add to GDP growth.
So let's now focus and talk to you about the anti-profiteering clause that you seem to be very perturbed about. The whole idea of anti-profiteering is that it should not, the benefits should be passed on and it should not be inflationary and the consumer should stand to gain. Why are you objecting to it?
It betrays a complete ignorance of economics. Tax is not the only thing that makes up cost. Tax on goods and price of goods are two different matters. Input costs can go up, transport costs can go up. Simply competition can drive down prices. Lack of competition can drive up prices. Increased demand can drive up prices. If they are internationally traded goods, imports can dampen prices. A fall in imports can increase prices. So it's absurd to assume that tax, the element of tax will decide what price I sell my goods. It is one element. And if the element of tax falls, it doesn't mean there should be a corresponding reduction in prices. Which means, something which I've always said, this government just does not believe in a market economy. This government does not believe in market forces. It pretends to be business friendly. It is certainly not faithful to the market idea.
So when you say that, tax is one of the components of cost, but the government has to take care of even that one component which is under its control.
Competition will take care of it. If you don't pass on the benefit of input tax credit or lower tax rate to the consumer, and I'm in the same market with the same product, and I see an opportunity, I will reduce my prices.
Are you scared that this could lead to tax harassment? Is that
Of course
the
it will.
that's
Of course it will. In fact, it is in a way pandering to the CBEC. The CBEC revolted. The officials of CBEC revolted when they had to share so-called tax sovereignty with the state governments, which is by this clumsy arrangement of 50% for states and 50% for centre, 90% for states and 10% for centre. Be that as it may. Therefore, they have given them this anti-profiteering weapon. I think it's completely outdated, contrary to all principles of economics. It should go, and take it from me, the next government, whoever it is, will repeal this clause.
That's a strong statement that this clause will be repealed.
It should be repealed by them. If they don't, it will be repealed by the next government.
I also
There is a competition commission. There is a consumer forum. They will address these issues.